whatever your view about this subject or any other subject, my worldview says if you are made in the image of God, no matter what you believe, no matter what you look like, no matter what your colour is, no matter what your sexual proclivities are or anything else, I must respect you. And I want to say that one of the great mistakes, even amongst some of the people in the Christian circles in my country over the last year or two, has been the mistake of defining human beings according to their sexuality. When I studied anthropology, I studied many cultures where gay social behaviour was accepted as normal, which it certainly was in the Roman Empire and in the Greek Empire. But in none of those cultures was the definition of marriage changed. In the days of St. Paul and the early church, there is one simple, clear, undeniable fact. And that fact is that although Jesus didn't take up the issue, he didn't need to. Because while he took up a lot of issues where he disagreed with attitude, like the attitude of punishing the women but letting the men get away with adultery, he took that on face to face. But nowhere does Jesus challenge the traditional Jewish view of the duality of a man and woman being married together. In one sense, I think doing what I'm going to do now actually is to put my reputation and life out there on the line. I once put a rather gentle article on Facebook by a non-Christian secular journalist who just simply wanted to say, if we have a plebiscite about the issue of same-sex marriage, can we at least respect and love one another and not be destructive towards those with whom we disagree? I was staggered at the amount of vitriol and serious attack on my mind and character that came not from fundamentalist Christians, from right-wing ideologues. For this was neither the left nor the right. It was just people that didn't agree with me because I said I believed in the traditional view of marriage. Well, it's almost over now. And some of my friends have said it's better to lay low and say nothing, because if you say anything, you're likely to be under severe attack and to be labelled as being a homophobe, a bitter person, all of those things. Well, I'm none of those things. I love human beings. And that comes out of my Christian view from an old verse in the Bible that says, "For we are all God's children, and he's not very far from any one of us." And I believe that. Therefore, whatever your view is about anything cannot take away in my heart the view that you, as myself, are a human being made in the image of God, whatever that means. And I feel that differing with someone is not grounds for hatred or for bitterness or for disrespect. But I want to take on a couple of issues very shortly. One issue that's a problem for me is that I believe in serious debate, and what I've seen about this issue is that basically there's been a shutdown on serious discussion about this. The other morning on morning television, one of the interviewers, that I wouldn't give high marks for brilliance intellectually, but he stated that really the people that were arguing for the traditional view of marriage only ever had emotional stuff and no reasoned arguments for their case. I found that quite offensive. You see, this here is what they call a dissertation. It's 186,000 words, 5 years of work, mainly centred in studying cultural anthropology. And I want to start by saying that my belief in marriage as a covenant relationship between a man and a woman is as much out of my anthropology as it is out of my Christian religious view. But let me start with this. There seems to be an argument around that a religious defence of a position makes it immediately non-rational and non-arguable. Well, I want to say to you that my study of anthropology, where doing it in the American system, I had to actually sit for exams, unlike PhDs in the British system. I had to do something like 28 subjects. And I had to sit for those exams. And the biggest area of study I did was the area called cultural anthropology. And the second area I took on, because despite the fact that the major intellectual that I was following for my argument about what we call revitalisation movements happened to be an atheist who said that by the turn of the millennium, by the time we came to the 2000s in human history, in actual fact, by then religion would have basically died. Now, he was saying that in the 50s. And I believed he was wrong, because I believe that there is something essentially religious and spiritual about the human mind. And if you rob the human mind of spiritual values, then I believe in the end it's like if you lack something serious in your diet. If you lack vitamin C, you get a disease. If you're out on boats and you don't have any oranges or good vitamin C, you end up getting an illness. And I felt that if we took away religion, in actual fact, we wouldn't end up without religion. We might end up with the collapse of religious institutions, but we would end up with a hunger for the infinite and a hunger for spiritual values. Now, I have no time to go through it in depth. This is the age of twittering, which I somewhat despise. I believe in thinking things through. But I just want to say that one thing studying secular anthropologists I found was that in actual fact, religion in all cultures has been a major force in developing ethical and social values, including human rights. Now, let me go to another thing very quickly. This is smaller, but it's much more significant than my green monster. It's written by a man called Samuel Murumba, who had to flee from his country when all of the rest of his legal firm were killed by Idi Amin. And he became a professor at Monash University. He decided to do a legal PhD on the subject of the cultural and conceptual basis of human rights norms in international law. And this is interesting because the main arguments about abandoning the traditional view of marriage have been that it's about human rights. Well, he is one of the world's great jurists. He's now Professor of Human Rights at Brooklyn Law School in New York. And he meets with other great legal minds every couple of years and they study the global situation about human rights. Sam rings me up every now and again and invites me to come over to America. He was in my church for quite some time. He's a great legal mind. In fact, he couldn't get someone to chair his committee when he did his PhD here in Australia. It ended up chaired by the Professor of International Law and Legal Philosophy at Yale University, who said that this dissertation was the most ambitious dissertation he'd ever seen, and possibly the most important document he'd ever read. You know what this book argues? It argues that if you take human rights and place them on a platform of sociology, then you will undermine in the end the very people you want to support in their search for human rights. Now, he knew a lot about that. He had to flee Uganda to save his life and his family's life. And he argues in this, having studied everything from the Code of Hammurabi through a huge number of international law studies from every sort of culture imaginable. He argues that for all of recorded human history, it is the transcendent, the ultimate sense of something bigger than ourselves, something beyond the mere sociology, the social grouping of any culture. Something beyond that is the foundation for human rights. That's interesting, given the way in which the argument about same-sex marriage has been given to us in a flood of media presentation. I want to say to you that this attempt to make it look as though it's silly and thoughtless if it comes from an Anglican bishop or from some religious source is intellectually nonsense. The fact is that concepts of an ultimate meaning and purpose has always been foundational to human values in every culture. The second thing I want to say is that we keep hearing on television, on the radio and the papers that the issue of marriage is an invention of the Christian church. That's nonsense. Great religions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and the islands of the Pacific all had concepts of marriage. And it's not an invention of the Christian church. It is an anthropological, cultural view that until just a few decades ago was virtually universal right across the world in all cultures. To make a change in that on the basis of a 1% vote of a population that isn't thinking very much and that is swamped by constant media data in one direction is very dangerous indeed. This is an issue of great significance. And I'm voting no because I believe it's not a religious issue, it's an ultimate human definition issue. I want to say to you, my friends, that in actual fact, marriage in all cultures has been between a man and a woman, or a man and several women, or a woman and several men. That's called polyandry, and that happens in some places like southern India. But it's still men and women, because marriage in all cultures was about children, about family. It never ever was on the basis of who you had the hots for. And that's the whole argument, the emotional argument we've had thrown at us. It's not about who you feel sexual attraction for, whether that be a child or whatever it be. It's not that. Because for most cultures, for most of history, family and the tribe had a great deal to say about who you ended up marrying anyway. It didn't come because you had psychosexual romantic feelings. You got married for all sorts of cultural reasons, but you got married to the opposite sex. And I want to say to you, I believe we've been done in by really false advertising and untrue history over the years. Now, I wish I could give a very long production on this, because I think this deserves a long debate. And because people are used to twittering, I can't do that. I want to recommend two things. I want to recommend a book called The Marriage Files. Now, The Marriage Files is a book not written by some Christian bishop. It's something written by a woman who, as far as I know, is more of a sociologist. This book, The Marriage Files, The Purpose, Limits and Fate of Marriage by Patricia Morgan, is published, interestingly enough, by the Wilberforce Publications. Isn't that interesting? An organisation that arises out of the battle against slavery, William Wilberforce. And that publication is sponsored by a group called Exploring Religion and Society, by the Oxford Centre for Religion and Public Life, and by the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children's Education and Research Trust. Just interesting. That's thoughtful stuff. It's not just a bunch of religious nutters. That's a serious examination of the significance of marriage in every culture, and why it's been collapsing in recent times, and why that collapse in marriage has opened the door to the debate about same-sex marriage. And the last thing I want to say in this far too short a presentation is that many people in the church, including the minister who's on the ads on telly at present saying, I'm voting yes because it's the right thing to do. Well, I don't think that's true. But I want to say to you that one of the very great Anglican thinkers, N.T. Wright, Bishop of Durham, who was hailed by Time magazine as one of the most formidable figures in Christian thought, has taken a real stand on this issue. And he talks about the complementarity of the Bible narrative. Man and woman, new heaven and new earth, all sorts of pairs. And in actual fact, he gives a terrific argument for this. You can look him up online and see what N.T. Wright is saying. One thing he says is that if you go back to the time of the last World War, it's fascinating that you get the German people who had such a strong Christian religious background, who forsook the basis of their Christian foundations. And they said that what they were doing was for the sake of going forward in civilization, for the sake of the German people. I want to say to you, my friends, it's important for us to understand that if you are going forward and you take a fork in the road that's a bad direction, really the only way for the health of the culture is to actually go back where you forked off the road. Because going forward doesn't necessarily mean going well at all. It depends on the direction you're going. And I want to say to you that, in actual fact, N.T. Wright has pointed out some very, very powerful things that have been forgotten. And this is my last one on this. I could talk for hours on this. But the last thing I want to say is simply this. When St. Paul and Jesus wrote and talked, well, of course, St. Paul wrote, Jesus talked, and others took his words and wrote them. But when they both spoke on issues of relationship, a lot of people will say, oh, well, after all, Jesus said, I don't condemn you either, so that means we shouldn't condemn anything. Well, they forget to quote the second half of that passage of Scripture, because he said, I don't condemn you either, but go and sin no more. So loving people and affirming people doesn't mean we necessarily agree with what's being said. And one of the things that N.T. Wright says very powerfully is this. He says that for Paul the Apostle, it was the Jewish faith that had shaped his life. And the Jews in his time were very clear about their view of marriage being between a man and a woman. And Paul writes extensively on this. The suggestion that somehow that's old-fashioned and so long ago that Paul didn't know what he was talking about shows complete ignorance of near ancient history. Because if you want to look at the history of the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire at that time, you will find that every possible position you could get into for sexual relationships was well known, etched on the walls of temples. It wasn't as though Paul and Jesus didn't know about all the different sexual positions and all the possibilities, because homosexuality was widely accepted as a practice, but the definition of marriage has not changed one iota. That's where we've been told a massive lie through the media. Paul didn't change the definition of marriage, but he was well aware of every possible configuration of sexual relationships that you could imagine. As I finish, I'm thinking of an image. When I went to Thessaloniki, Paul wrote to the Thessalonians. And I remember when I went to Thessaloniki, I went to see some of these beautiful little ancient places on the top of these mountaintops. And down below was a special place for tourists. And I was staggered, because in that place were beautiful pictures and icons of great religious saints. And on a table just a few yards away were ashtrays and other mementos with pictures of multiple sex, homosexual and heterosexual, and multiple persons in all sorts of sexual acts, explicitly shown on these particular ancient pictures that had been placed on various things that you could buy as a tourist. There's nothing new under the sun, folks, except what is new is that after this long, long period in human history, we're suddenly seeking to redefine the fundamental unit upon which the human family is based. And I think a plebiscite, and whether 2% or 3% or 1% of people done over by the media becomes the basis for a change on such a fundamental issue is a great concern indeed. I'm voting no, because I believe that anthropologically it's obvious why we were created the way we are. And if we have struggles with that, it doesn't mean we should be despised, but neither does it mean we should redefine something that for millennia has been held across all sorts of culture to be a sacred covenant relationship between the opposite sexes, not the same sex. And that's not a nasty statement of hate towards my brothers and sisters that live out a different lifestyle to me. But it is something we need to think very seriously about before we vote. And I'm voting no for anthropological reasons, historical reasons, and religious ethical reasons, because I think it's the right thing to do.